Me Before You by Jojo Moyes. Chapter 7. Spring arrived overnight, as if winter, like some unwanted guest, had abruptly shrugged its way into its coat and vanished, without saying goodbye. Everything became greener, the roads bathed in watery sunshine, the air suddenly balmy. There were hints of something floral and welcoming in the air, birdsong the gentle backdrop to the day. I didn't notice any of it. I had stayed at Patrick's house the evening before. It was the first time I had seen him for almost a week due to his enhanced training schedule, but having spent 40 minutes in the bath with half a pack of bath salts, he was so exhausted he could barely talk to me. I had begun stroking his back in a rare attempt at seduction, and he had murmured that he was really too tired, his hand flicking as if he were swatting me away. I was still awake and staring at his ceiling discontentedly for 4 hours later. Patrick and I had met while I was doing the only other job I had ever held, that of a trainee at the Cutting Edge, Hillsbury only unisex hairdresser. He walked in while Samantha, the proprietor, was busy, asking for number 4. I gave him what he described afterward as not only the worst haircut that he ever had, but the worst haircut in the history of mankind. 3 months later, realizing that a love of fiddling with my own hair did not necessarily mean that I was cut out to do anyone else's, I left and got the job at the cafe with Frank. When we started going out, Patrick had been working in sales, and his favorite things could have been listed as beer, candy bars from the gas station, talking about sports, and sex, doing, not talking about, in that order. A good night out for us would probably comprise of all 4. He was ordinary-looking rather than handsome, and his bum was podgier than mine, but I liked it. I liked the solidity of him, the way he felt when I wrapped myself around him. His dad was dead, and I liked the way he acted toward his mother, protective and solicitous. And his 4 brothers and sisters were like the Waltons. They actually seemed to like one another. The first time we went out on a date, a little voice in my head said, "This man will never hurt you," and nothing he has done in the 7 years since has led me to doubt it. And then he turned into Marathon Man. Patrick's stomach no longer gave when I nested into him. It was hard, unforgiving thing, like a sideboard, and he was prone to pulling up his shirt and hitting it with things to prove quite how hard it was. His face was planned and weathered from his time spent constantly outdoors. His thighs were solid muscle. That would have been sexy in itself had he actually wanted to have sex, but we were down to about twice a month, and I wasn't the kind to ask. It was as if the fitter he got, the more obsessed by his own shape he became, and the less interested he was in mine. I asked him a couple of times if he didn't fancy me any more, but he seemed pretty definite. "You're gorgeous," he would say. "I'm just shattered. Anyway, I don't want you to lose weight. The girls at the club, you couldn't make one decent boob out of all theirs put together." I wanted to ask how exactly he had come to work out this complex equation, but it was basically a nice thing to say, so I let it go. I wanted to be interested in what he did. I really did. I went to the triathlon club nights. I tried to chat with the other girls, but I soon realized I was an anomaly. There were no girlfriends like me. Everyone else in the club was single, or involved with someone equally physically impressive. The couples pushed each other in workouts, planned weekends in spandex shorts, and carried pictures of each other in their wallets, completing triathlons hand in hand, or smugly comparing joint medals. It was unspeakable. It's not that I was some kind of sex maniac. We've been together a long time after all. It's just that some perverse bit of me had begun to question my own attractiveness. Patrick had never minded the fact that I dressed inventively, as he put it, but what if he hadn't been entirely truthful? Patrick's job, his whole social life, now revolved around the control of flesh, taming it, reducing it, owning it. What if, faced with those tight little track-suited bottoms, my own suddenly seemed wanting? What if my curves, which I had always thought of as pleasantly voluptuous, now seemed doughy to his exacting eyes? These were the thoughts that were still humming messily around my head as Mrs. Traynor came in and pretty much ordered Will and me to go outside. "I've asked the cleaners to come and do a special spring clean, so I thought perhaps you would enjoy the nice weather while they're all in there." Will's eyes met mine with the faintest lift of his eyebrows. It's not really a request, is it, Mother? I just think it would be good if you took some air, she said. The ramps is in this place. Perhaps, Louisa, you might take some tea out there with you? It wasn't an entirely unreasonable suggestion. The garden was beautiful. It was as if this slight lifting of temperatures, everything had suddenly decided to look a little bit greener. Daffodils had emerged as if from nowhere, their yellowing bulbs hinting at the flowers to come. Buds burst from brown branches, perennials forcing their way tentatively through the dark, claggy soil. I opened the doors and we went outside, Will keeping his chair on the York stone path. He gestured toward a cast-iron bench with a cushion on it, and I sat there for some time, our faces lifted to the weak sunshine, listening to the sparrows squabbling in the hedgerow. "What's up with you?" "What do you mean?" "You're quiet." "You said you wanted me to be quiet." "Not this quiet. It alarms me." "I'm all right," I said, and then, "It's just boyfriend stuff, if you really want to know." "Ah," he said, "Running Man." I opened my eyes just to see if he was mocking me. "What's the matter?" he said. "Come on, tell Uncle Will." "No. My mother is going to have the cleaners running around like lunatics in there for at least another hour. You're going to have to talk about something." I pushed myself upright and turned to face him. His house chair had a control button that elevated his seat so he could address people at head height. He didn't often use it, as it frequently made him dizzy, but it was working now. I actually had to look up at him. I pulled my coat around me and squinted at him. "Go on, then. What do you want to know?" "How long have you two been together?" he said. "A bit over 6 years." He looked surprised. "That's a long time." "Yes," I said. "Well..." I leaned over and adjusted a rug across him. It was deceptive, the sunshine. It promised more than it could actually deliver. "What does he do?" "He's a personal trainer." "Hence the running." "Hence the running." "What's he like? In 3 words, if it makes you uncomfortable." I thought about it. Positive, loyal, obsessed with body fat ratios. That's 7 words. Then you got 4 for free. So what is she like? What was she like? Who? Alicia. I looked at him the way he had looked at me, directly. He took a deep breath and gazed upward to a large, plain tree. His hair fell down into his eyes, and I fought the urge to push it to one side for him. Gorgeous, sexy, high maintenance, surprisingly insecure. What does she have to be insecure about? The words left my mouth before I could help myself. He looked almost amused. "You'd be surprised," he said. "Girls like Lisa made trade on their looks for so long that they didn't think they had anything else. Actually, I'm being unfair. She's good with stuff. Things, clothes, interiors. She can make things look beautiful." I fought the urge to say anyone could make things look beautiful if they had a wallet as deep as a diamond mine. She could move a few things around in a room and it would look completely different. I never could work out how she did it. He nodded toward the house. "She did this annex when I first moved in." I found myself reviewing the perfectly designed living room. I realized my admiration of it was suddenly slightly less uncomplicated than it had been. "How long were you with her?" 8, 9 months. "Not that long." "Long for me." "How did you meet?" "Dinner party. A really awful dinner party. You?" "Hairdressers. I was one. He was my client." "Ha! You were his something extra for the weekend." I must have looked blank because he shook his head and said softly, "Never mind." Inside we could hear the dull drone of the vacuum cleaner. There were 4 women in the cleaning company, all wearing matching housecoats. I'd wondered what they would find to do for 2 more hours in the little annex. "Did you miss her? Or do you miss her?" Will seemed to be watching something in the distance. "I used to." He turned to me, his voice matter of fact. "But I've been thinking about it, and I've decided that she and Rupert are a good match." I nodded. "They'll have a ridiculous wedding, pop out an ankle bitter or 2, as you put it, buy a place in the country, and he'll be shagging his secretary within 5 years," I said. "You're probably right." I was warming to my theme now, and she will be a little bit cross with him all the time without really knowing why, and complain to him about all the really awful dinner parties to the embarrassment of their friends, and he won't want to leave because he'll be scared of all the alimony. Will turned to look at me. "And they will have sex once every 6 weeks, and he will adore his children while doing absolutely nothing to help look after them. and she will have perfect hair, but get this kind of pinched face. I narrowed my mouth, through never saying what she actually means, and start an insane pilot's habitat, or maybe buy a dog or a horse, and develop a crush on her riding instructor, and he will take it up jogging when he hits 40, and maybe buy a Harley Davidson, which she will despise, and every day he will go to work and look at all the young men in his office and listen in bars to who they pulled on the weekend, or where they went on a jolly, and feel like somehow, and he will never be quite sure how, he got suckered. I turned. Will was staring at me. Sorry, I said after a moment. I don't really know where that came from. I'm starting to feel just the tiniest bit sorry for Running Man. Oh, it's not him, I said. It's working at a cafe for years. You see and hear everything, patterns in people's behavior. You'd be amazed at what goes on. Is that why you've never gotten married? I blinked. I suppose so. I didn't want to say I'd never actually been asked. It may sound as though we didn't do much, but in truth, the days with Will were subtly different, depending on his mood and, more importantly, how much pain he was in. Some days I would arrive and I could see from the set of his jaw that he didn't want to talk to me, or to anyone, and noting this, I would busy myself around the annex, trying to anticipate his needs, so that I didn't have to bother him by asking. There were all sorts of things that caused him pain. There were the general aches that came with loss of muscle. There were so much less holding him up, despite Nathan's best attempts at physio. There was stomach pain from digestive problems, shoulder pain, pain from bladder infections, and inevitability, apparently, despite everyone's best efforts. He had a stomach ulcer from taking too many painkillers early on in his recovery, which he apparently popped them like tic-tacs. Occasionally, there were pressure sores from being seated in the same position for too long. A couple of times, Will was confined to a bed just to let them heal. But he hated being prone. He would lie there listening to the radio, his eyes glittering with barely suppressed rage. Will also got headaches, a side effect, I thought, of his anger and frustration. He had so much mental energy and nothing to take it out on. It had to build up somewhere. But the most deliberating was a burning sensation in his hands and feet, restless, pulsing. It would leave him unable to focus on anything else. I would prepare a bowl of cold water and soak them, or wrap cold flannels around them, hoping to ease his discomfort. A stringy muscle would flicker in his jaw, and occasionally he would just seem to disappear, as if the only way he could cope with the sensation was to absent himself from his own body. I had become surprisingly used to the physical requirements of Will's life. It seemed unfair that despite the fact that he could not use them or feel them, his extremities should cause him so much discomfort. Despite all this, Will did not complain. This was why it had taken me 2 weeks to notice that he suffered at all. Now I could decipher the strained look around his eyes, the silences, the way he seemed to retreat inside his own skin. He would ask, simply, "Could you get the cold water, Louisa?" Or, "I think it might be time for some painkillers." Sometimes he was in so much pain that his face actually leached color, turning to pale putty. Those were the worst days. But on other days we tolerated each other quite well. He didn't seem mortally offended when I talked to him, as he had at the start. Today appeared to be a pain-free day. When Mrs. Traynor came out to tell us that the cleaners would be another 20 minutes, I made us both another drink and we took a slow stroll around the garden. Will sticking to the path and me watching my satin pumps darken in the damp grass. Interesting choice of footwear, Will said. They were emerald green. I had found them in a thrift shop. Patrick said they made me look like a leprechaun drag queen. You know, you don't dress like someone from around here. I quite look forward to seeing what insane combination you're going to turn up in next. So how should someone from around here dress? He steered a little to the left to avoid a bit of branch on the path. Fleece, or if you're my mother's set, something from Jaguar or Whistles. He looked at me. So where did you pick up your exotic tastes? Where else have you lived? I haven't. What? You've only ever lived here? Only here. I turned and looked at him, crossing my arms over my chest defensively. So what's weird about that? It's such a small town, so limiting, and it's all about the castle. We paused on the path and stared at it, rising up in the distance on its weird, dome-like hill, as perfect as it had been drawn by a child. I always think this is the kind of place that people come back to when they've become tired of everything else, or when they don't have enough imagination to go anywhere else. Thanks. There's nothing wrong with it, per se, but, Christ, it's not exactly dynamic, is it? Not exactly full of ideas or interesting people or opportunities. Around here, they think it's subversive if the tourist shops start selling placemats with different view of a miniature railway. I couldn't help but laugh. There had been an article in the local newspaper the previous week on exactly that topic. You're 26 years old, Clark. You should be out there, claiming the world as your own, getting into trouble in bars, showing off your strange wardrobe to dodgy men. I'm happy here, I said. Well, you shouldn't be. You like telling people what they should be doing, don't you? Only when I know I'm right, he said. Can you adjust my drink? I can't quite reach it. I twisted his straw around so that he could reach it more easily and waited while he took a drink. The faint cold had turned the tips of his ears pink. He grimaced. Jesus, for a girl who made tea for a living, you make a terrible cup. You're just used to lesbian tea, I said. All that lapsang Souchong herbal stuff. Lesbian tea, he almost choked. Well, it's better than this stair varnish. Christ, you could stand a spoon up in that. So even my tea is wrong. I sat down on the bench in front of him. So how is it okay for you to offer an opinion on every single thing I say or do, and yet nobody else gets to say anything at all? Go on then, Louisa Clark. Give me your opinions. On you? He gave a theatrical sigh. Do I have a choice? You could cut your hair. It makes you look like some kind of vagrant. Now you sound like my mother. Well, you do look bloody awful. You could shave at least. Isn't all that facial hair starting to get itchy? He gave me a sideways look. It is, isn't it? I knew it. Okay, this afternoon I'm going to take it all off. Oh no. Yes, you asked me for my opinion. This is my answer. You don't have to do anything. What if I say no? I might do it anyway. If it gets any longer, I'll be picking bits of food out of it. And frankly, if that happens, I'll have to sue you for undue distress in the workplace. He smiled then, as if I had amused him. It might sound a bit sad, but Will's smiles were so rare that prompting one made me feel light-headed with pride. Here, Clark, he said, do me a favor. What? Scratch my ear for me, will you? It's driving me nuts. If I do, you'll let me cut your hair? Just a bit of a trim? Don't push your luck. Shush. Don't make me nervous. I'm not great with scissors. I found the razors and some shaving foam in the bathroom cabinet, tucked well back behind the packets of wipes and cotton wool, as if they hadn't been used in some time. I made him come into the bathroom, filled a sink with warm water, got him to tilt his headrest back a little, and then placed a hot flannel over his chin. What is this? You're going to be a barber shop? What's the flannel for? I don't know, I confessed. It's what they do in the films. It's like the hot water in towels when somebody has a baby. I couldn't see his mouth, but his eyes creased with faint mirth. I wanted to keep them like that. I wanted him to be happy, for his face to lose that haunted, watchful look. I gabbled. I told jokes. I started to hum. Anything to prolong the moment before he looked grim again. I rolled up my sleeves and began to lather the shaving foam over his chin, all the way up to his ears. Then I hesitated, the blade over his chin. Is this the moment to tell you I've only ever done legs before? He closed his eyes and settled back. I began to scrape gently at his skin with the blade. The silence broken only by the splash as I rinsed the razor in the basin full of water. I worked in silence, studying Will Trainor's face as I went. The lines that ran to the corners of his mouth, lines that seemed prematurely deep for his age. I smoothed his hair from the side of his face and saw the telltale tracks of stitches, perhaps from his accident. I saw the mauve shadows that told of nights and nights of lost sleep, the furrow between his brows that spoke of silent pain. A warm sweetness rose from his skin, the scent of shaving cream, and something that was peculiar to Will himself, discreet and expensive. His face began to emerge, and I could see how easy it must have been for him to attract someone like Alicia. I worked slowly and carefully, encouraged by the fact that he seemed briefly at peace. The thought flashed by that the only time anyone ever touched Will was for some medical or therapeutic procedure, and so I let my fingers rest lightly upon his skin, trying as much as possible to make the movements as far from dehumanized briskness they characterized Nathan's and the doctor's interactions with him. It was a curiously intimate thing, this shaving of Will. I realized as I continued that I had assumed his wheelchair would be a barrier, that his disability would prevent any kind of sensual aspect from creeping in. Weirdly, it wasn't working like that. It was impossible to be this close to someone, to feel their skin tauten under your fingertips, to breathe in the air that they breathed out, and to have their face only inches from yours, without feeling a little unbalanced. By the time I reached his other ear, I had begun to feel awkward, as if I had overstepped an invisible mark. Perhaps Will was about to read the subtle changes in my pressure on his skin. Perhaps he was just more attuned to the moods of people around him. But he opened his eyes, and I found them looking into mine. There was a short pause, and then he said, straight-faced, "Please don't tell me you've shaved off my eyebrows." "Only the one," I said. I rinsed the blade, hoping that the color would have drained from my cheeks by the time I turned around. "Right," I said finally. "Have you had enough? Won't Nathan be here in a bit?" "What about my hair?" he said. "You really want me to cut it?" "You might as well." "I thought you didn't trust me." He shrugged as far as he could. It was the smallest of movement of his shoulders. "If it will stop you moaning at me for a couple of weeks, I figure it'll be a small price to pay." "Oh my gosh, your mom is going to be so delighted," I said, wiping a stray dab of shaving cream. "Yes, well, we won't let that put us off." We cut his hair in the living room. I lit the fire. We put on a film, an American thriller, and I placed a towel around his shoulders. I had warned Will that I was a bit rusty, but added that it couldn't look worse than it did already. "Thanks for that," he said. I set to work, letting his hair slide through my fingertips, trying to remember the few basics I had learned. Will, watching the film, seemed relaxed and almost content. Occasionally, he told me something about the film, what else the lead actor had starred in, where he had first seen it, and I made a vaguely interested noise, like I do with Thomas when he presents me with his toys, even though all my attention was actually focused on not mucking up his hair. Finally, I had the worst of it off, and wiped around in front of him to see how he looked. "Well," Will paused the DVD. I straightened up. "I'm not sure I like seeing this much of your face. It's a bit unnerving." "Feels cold," he had observed, moving his head from left to right as if testing the feel of it. "Hold on," I said. "I'll get 2 mirrors, then you can see it properly, but don't move. There's still a bit of tidying up to be done, possibly an ear to slice." I was in the bedroom, going through his drawers in search of a small mirror, when I heard the door. 2 sets of brisk footsteps, Mrs. Trainor's voice, lifted, anxious. "Georgiana, please don't." The door to the living room was wrenched open. I grabbed the mirror and ran out of the room. I had no intention of being found absent again. Mrs. Trainor was standing in the living room doorway, both hands raised to her mouth, apparently witnessing some unseen confrontation. "You are the most selfish man I ever met," a young woman was shouting. "I can't believe this, Will. You were selfish then, and worse now." "Georgina," Mrs. Trainor's gaze flicked toward me as I approached. "Please stop." I walked into the room behind her. Will, the towel around his shoulders, soft, brown fronds of hair at the wheels of his chair, was facing a young woman. She had long, dark hair pinned into a messy knot at the back of her head. Her skin was tanned, and she was wearing expensively distressed jeans and suede boots. Like Alicia, her features were beautiful and regular, her teeth the astonishing white of a toothpaste commercial. I knew they were, because her face puce with anger, she was still hissing at him. "I can't believe it. I can't believe you would ever think of it. Why do you—" "Please, Georgina," Mrs. Trainor's voice lifted sharply. "This is not the time." Will, his face impassive, was staring straight ahead of him at some unseen point. Will, do you need any help?" I said quietly. "Who are you?" the young woman said, whipping around. It was then that I saw her eyes were filled with tears. "Georgina," Will said. "Meet Louisa Clark, my paid companion and shockingly inventive hairdresser. Louisa, meet my sister, Georgina. She appears to have flown all the way from Australia to shriek at me." "Don't be facile," Georgina said. "Mummy told me. She told me everything." Nobody moved. "Shall I give you a minute?" I said. "That would be a good idea." Mrs. Trainor's knuckles were white on the arm of the sofa. I slid out of the room. "In fact, Louisa, perhaps now would be a good time for you to take your lunch break." It was going to be a bus shelter kind of day. I grabbed my sandwiches from the kitchen, climbed into my coat, and set off down the back path. As I left, I could hear Georgina Trainor's voice lifting inside the house. Has it ever occurred to you, Will, that believe it or not, this might not just be about you? When I returned exactly half an hour later, the house was silent. Nathan was washing a mug in the kitchen sink. He turned as he saw me. How are you doing? Has she gone? Who? The sister. He glanced behind me. Ah, that's who it was. Yeah, she's gone. Just skidding off in the car when I got here. Some sort of family row, was it? I don't know, I said. I was in the middle of cutting Will's hair, and this woman came in and just started having a go at him. I assumed it was just another girlfriend. Nathan shrugged. I realized he would not be interested in the personal affairs of Will's life, even if he knew. He's a bit quiet, though. Nice work with the shave, by the way. Good to get him out from behind all that shrubbery. I walked back into the living room. Will was sitting staring at the television, which was still paused at the exact moment I had left it. Do you want me to turn this back on? I said. He didn't seem to hear me for a minute. He was sunk in his shoulders, the early relaxed expression replaced by a veil. Will was closed off again, locked behind something I couldn't penetrate. He blinked, as if he had only just noticed me there. Sure, he said. I was carrying a basket of washing down the hall when I heard them. The annex door was slightly ajar, and the voices of Mrs. Trainor and her daughter carried down the long corridor, the sound coming in muted waves. Will's sister was sobbing quietly, all the fury gone from her voice now. She sounded almost childlike. There must be something they can do, some medical advance. Can't you take him to America? Things are always improving in America. Your father keeps a very close eye on all the developments, but no, darling, there is nothing. Concrete. He's so different now. It's like he's determined not to see the good in anything. He's been like that since the start, George. I think it's just that you didn't see him apart from when you flew home. Back then, I think he was still determined. Back then, he was sure that something would change. I felt a little uncomfortable listening in on such a private conversation, but the odd tenor drew me in closer. I found myself walking softly toward the door, my soaked feet making no sound on the floor. Look, Daddy, I didn't tell you. We didn't want to upset you, but he tried. She struggled over the words. He tried to kill himself. What? Daddy found him back in December. It was terrible. Even though this really only confirmed why I had guessed, I felt all the blood drain from me. I heard a muffled cry, a whispered reassurance. There was another long silence. And then Georgina, her voice thick with grief, spoke again. The girl? Yes, Louisa is here to make sure nothing like that happens again. I stopped. At the other end of the corridor from the bathroom, I could hear Nathan and Will talking in a low murmur, comfortably oblivious to the conversation that was going on just a few feet away. I took a step closer to the door. I suppose I had known it since I caught sight of the scars on his wrist. It made sense of everything, after all. Mrs. Trainor's anxiety that I shouldn't leave Will alone for very long, his antipathy to having me there, the fact that for large stretches of time I didn't feel like I was doing anything useful at all. I'd been babysitting. I hadn't known it, but Will had, and he had hated me for it. I reached for the handle of the door, preparing to close it gently. I wondered what Nathan knew. I wondered whether Will was happier now. I realized I felt, selfishly, a faint relief that it hadn't been me Will objected to, just the fact that anyone, had been employed to watch over him. You can't let him do this, Mum. You have to stop him. It's not our choice, darling. But it is. It is, if he's asking you to be part of it, Georgina protested. The handle stilled in my hand. I can't believe you're even agreeing to it. What about your religion? What about everything you've done? What was the point? And you even bloody saving him the last time. Mrs. Trainor's voice was deliberately calm. That's not fair. But you've said you'll take him. Do you think for a moment that if I said I refuse, he wouldn't ask someone else? But, Denitas, it is just wrong. I know it's hard for him, but it will destroy you and Daddy. I know it. Think of how you would feel. Think of the publicity, your job, both your reputations. He must know it. It's a selfish thing to even ask. How can he? How can he do this? How can you do this? She began to sob again. George, don't look at me like that. I do care about him, Mummy. I do. He's my brother and I love him, but I can't bear it. I can't bear even the thought of it. He's wrong to ask and you're wrong to consider it. And it's not just his own life he will destroy if you go ahead with this." I took a step back from the window. The blood thumped so loudly in my ears that I almost didn't hear Mrs. Trainor's response. 6 months, George. He promised to give me 6 months. Now I don't want you to mention this again, and certainly not in front of anyone else. And we must, she took a deep breath, we must just pray very hard that something happens in that time to change his mind. And that's the end of chapter 7.